Today I'm catching up with Steve Orenstein. How are you, Steve?
Good, Darcy. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
No worries.
So you're with Locate Technologies. You're the CEO and founder of Locate Technologies.
Correct. Yes.
Why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about what that business does?
Yeah, sure. We sell logistics software. So we've got customers in Australia and also across the world. And essentially for companies that are generally managing their own fleet of drivers, and we help them to do things like route optimization. And so you imagine a company that has, 30 or 50 or 100 drivers. They've got to figure out which of those deliveries they've got to go to which drivers on which particular days. Our system will do all that route optimization for them. And then for the consumer that's receiving that delivery, we provide a live tracking link. So you can see the live location of that driver. You can see the estimated arrival time and giving that really great sort of customer experience. We originally started 2014, and that was with a company called Zoom2U, and we still run that today. And that's where we run it's like Uber for delivery. So we run a same day, 3-hour delivery service across the Australian market for large e-commerce businesses and retail businesses, but also lots of consumers and small business use the platform.
That's cool. And it's listed on the Australian stock exchange.
It is.
Currently.
It is.
More on that in a second.
Yes.
So I read somewhere that you sold your car to buy Bitcoin, and then you try to convince your board to put Bitcoin on the balance sheet for a company. So yeah, let's start with your Bitcoin story. Why did you sell your car? And was it a nice car? Like, was it?
It was.
A Corolla?
Look, I'd been buying Bitcoin sort of first started about 2017. So pretty early on, I think Bitcoin was sort of around that sort of $10,000 mark. And probably didn't really understand necessarily what I was buying. I understood the technology aspect of what Bitcoin was, but not necessarily the impact of what's happening in the economy and with markets and money and how money's being printed by governments. And it was probably, so I just bought it, held it. And I think during COVID, sort of just before COVID happened, I started seeing what was happening in the news in China. And I was like, well, if this spreads across the world, if COVID starts spreading like how quickly it is in China and what they're doing with building all the hospitals, this is going to be bad for the economy and this is going to be bad for the world. And so I actually liquidated my portfolio, actually still held my Bitcoin, but any of my shares and stocks I actually liquidated into cash. And this was sort of towards the end of January. And then the stock market crashed as COVID sort of came alive. But then the stock market rebounded really quickly. And I couldn't work out why that was happening. And what I realized was post that event was actually governments started printing all this money. And this enormous flood of money came into the market. And then obviously now what we're experiencing is the inflation that's then occurred off the back of that. And so that sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole to sort of dig deeper into all of this. And I had some family members that were looking at this as well in a lot of detail and started to see the value of Bitcoin and how Bitcoin is built in an algorithm. The rules are all set at the beginning. There's this set supply. There's the 21 million Bitcoin that can never be created. And you can't have a government being able to just print endless amounts of money. And I think this comes back to, when the gold standard was dropped in, the 1970s. And so, that was, the journey of me sort of owning Bitcoin. And then, now sort of in the last few years of seeing sort of the adoption started to occur. And now Bitcoin's been around for, over 15 years. And a lot of the risks that were there, in the early days have now been removed. You've now got the adoption, you've now got the ETFs, you've got, governments across the world that are starting to build their own treasury. And so, I look at then every other asset that I own, I'm going, well, far out. If I had that in Bitcoin and hold that for the next 10 years in Bitcoin, this asset is going to be worth so much more being held in Bitcoin. And so I started doing that, thinking about that in my personal life. And I had a really nice car, had a nice red Maserati, and it was nice to drive and whatever. But at the same time, I didn't drive that often. I live quite close to my office. And so I walked to work. And I decided it was time to sell it and take that money and put it straight into Bitcoin.
Fantastic. Going back to what you were saying though, around when you started noticing things, right? Like you started noticing more, you became more macro aware, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's probably what I struggled with as well. And I think a lot of people struggle with that, is that you might be really smart in business and really switched on.
Correct.
I'm gathering that was definitely the case with you. And then it still wasn't enough though. Like being smart doesn't mean you get it.
Yeah.
It's just where you look.
Correct.
Where you place your eyeballs.
Yeah.
And so, I guess that's what's so cool about the pandemic period, is that we all started to look in other places and apply our intellect in other places.
Yeah.
And if we were fortunate enough to be disrupted during that time, it was a real blessing, I guess. Because
Definitely.
when you were talking to your board and you were trying to get them to adopt a strategy that you've adopted personally with the company, did you find that it required a similar sort of shift?
Whether it's a board or a regulatory body, it's very easy to say no. It's the easiest answer to give, say, no, let's not look at this. And our board's not like that. Our board's very open and always looking to explore and understand things. And I didn't warn them about this pitch that I went into this for this one board meeting. But we've been speaking at the board level, around, okay, well, our company's heading closer and closer towards profitability. What's our next stage of growth that's going to occur inside of the business? And, having been owning Bitcoin for some time, I thought, well, actually, and looking at sort of what was happening in the US with like MicroStrategy and our strategy and some of the others that were occurring in these Bitcoin treasury businesses, I thought it made a lot of sense for us to do this in the Australian market. And so that was about the middle of last year. We sort of started that journey and just educating them on, what is Bitcoin, how you hold and store Bitcoin, what does cold storage look like, why it's valuable, and sort of, the 21 million supply limits, all those types of things. And then looking at examples of other companies like MicroStrategy and their playbook and what they've actually done. And so I think that took a couple of different board meetings to sort of get them to get up to speed and get an understanding. And then they were like, okay, well, now let's take the next step, and let's go and speak to the ASX. Let's go speak to your key investors and see what sort of reaction that you get. And we got some different degrees of reactions from different investors. Some that were like, okay, Steve, we believe in you, we'll back you. Others were like, Steve, you sure? Like, why are you doing this? And is this a distraction from your core business? And others were like, Steve, you're completely nuts. Like, and, there was one that was, very annoyed that I was considering this particular strategy. And so that took a little bit of time of like self-reflection to think about, okay, why am I doing this? And is this in the best interest of all our shareholders? And I truly believe this is the best interest of all our shareholders. And, we're busy building a business and building a company, but actually the best asset today is going to be us holding some Bitcoin in our balance sheet and taking the profits and building into Bitcoin, or using our stock to be able to buy more Bitcoin today, because Bitcoin highly likely over the next 10, 20 years is going to be worth substantially more than it is today. And that's not consensus across the market. Most people don't think that. And so I think that's part of the opportunity, is that most people don't understand this, and it is quite a complex topic to understand. And that's the opportunity right now.
If everybody agreed
Correct
with you, it's not an opportunity.
Correct.
And I think if everybody jumped in on a certain set of stocks right when the pandemic hit, because it was obvious that they were going to do really well because of lockdown, of course everybody was right.
Yes.
But all those stocks have now kind of tanked.
Correct.
Or
Exactly.
they've gone back to where they were.
Exactly.
So when you're facing that resistance and you're doubting yourself, you probably are crazy. Or
exactly.
You might be onto something.
Yeah. You see something that others don't.
You see something that others don't. And we're in this unique crossover time, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Still.
Definitely.
And it, again, it's such a good blessing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's the word that I keep on landing on, rather than opportunity or gift. Like, it just, sometimes you find yourself in the right place at the right
time.
I think so. And you just do the right thing.
Yeah.
So with the ASX right now, there's something called the cash box rules. I don't understand the cash box rules, and a lot of people listening might not understand that at all. So do you want to explain what that means?
So the rule is that you can't have more than 50% of your assets sitting in cash or cash alike. And so when we started to acquire Bitcoin, then we started to get closer and closer to that 50% rule. And our expectation wasn't that Bitcoin would be classified as cash. It's deemed by the Australian Tax Office as property.
Yeah.
And so we didn't see this as being an issue. We'd spoken to the ASX beforehand. I don't think they necessarily had thought about it too deeply about what we were planning on doing. And as we started to sort of announce our first announcements of buying Bitcoin, even though we'd announced previously that we were going to change our treasury policy, and this is what our new treasury policy enabled the company to buy Bitcoin, I probably caught them a little bit off guard. And then they wanted to talk in a lot more detail, and they were trying to get their head around this. They hadn't thought about this. They hadn't been looking at what was happening across the world. So they were then trying to figure out, okay, we need to develop a policy on what does this actually look like. And so we didn't breach the 50%. We got very close. We're about 48%. And so we had to then say, well, do we really want to do this strategy? And we do. And so we need to then look for alternatives.
And what do you think was it? Like you said before, it's easy to say no.
Yeah.
Was that what it was, do you think,
so.
in the end?
I think so. I think that this hasn't been thought through in a lot of detail. And, I think it's in a lot of the regulatory bodies, particularly I've seen in Australia, even at the Reserve Bank, they don't understand what Bitcoin is. They don't want to call it a currency. They think it's not backed by anything, not realizing that their fiat currency is not backed by anything. It used to be backed by gold. It's not by anything. It's backed by the government, and the government ability to endlessly print money, and will need to endlessly print money because of the amount of debt that's in the governments.
Yeah. The reason why we're catching up is because you're coming to, or your business Locate is now going to be relocating
Correct.
into New Zealand and listing on the NZX.
Correct.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
I think that's phenomenal. Well, we haven't had a new listing in the New Zealand Stock Exchange for, I think, 15 months or so.
I think it's, as a direct listing, I believe it's about 4 years.
4 years.
I think so.
Phenomenal. So, this is massive for New Zealand. Now, do you think you're going to have the same sort of problem here where they're going to discover or reinterpret something and say, hey, no, you can't do that here?
No. Yeah, I mean, we'll be the first ASX company listing on the NZX, so no one's actually gone the other way. A lot of New Zealand companies go and move and list on the ASX. We've been very transparent with the NZX. We've spoken in a lot of detail. And so when this originally came up, I think around June, July, we went to market across the world and looked at lots of exchanges. In fact, there's no other exchange that I found that has this same cash box rule. It doesn't exist. So whether that was, going to Frankfurt in Germany or the Canadian, even some of the US exchanges, the cash box rule doesn't exist. And so, we spoke with the NZX and we said, this is what we're planning on doing. They're not anti-Bitcoin or anti-crypto in any way. They really think this is a good story for the NZX.
It is.
And this allows, investors, New Zealand investors, to get access and get some exposure to Bitcoin, as well as the software business as well.
That's cool. And we should probably, at this stage, or maybe even earlier on, we should have said this, just for those that might be still struggling with the idea of what is Bitcoin. Obviously, that's an important conversation, and people need to do a bit of time to really understand what Bitcoin is.
Definitely.
For the sake of this conversation, we won't go there. We'll just say it's digital gold, for lack of a better term. And I think that's a pretty good term anyway. But tell me about the strategy playbook. So Michael Saylor heads up MicroStrategy, now called Strategy.
Yep.
I believe earlier this year, you were at a conference in Florida learning about how he has adopted a similar strategy where he's acquiring Bitcoin and holding it on his balance sheet.
Correct.
And doing a lot more interesting things with it as well. So in your words, break down the strategy that you're going to be using around how you acquire Bitcoin. How are you going to go about doing it?
Yeah. We see Bitcoin as being this really valuable asset, and to hold large amounts of Bitcoin sitting on our balance sheet. And it's holding it, it's not trading it, it's not trying to time the market. It's like, we believe in 10, 20 years time and shorter, Bitcoin will be a very valuable asset. And because of that limited supply. And so we want to acquire as much Bitcoin as we can. We will use our balance sheet to do that. And so we'll do that through a variety of different ways. We'll do it through equity raises. And so we'll raise capital. We'll buy more Bitcoin. Once we have a certain amount of Bitcoin sitting on our balance sheet, then we'll start thinking about some debt products. There'll be non-margin based debt instruments that we'll use. So that allows us to use our balance sheet to take on some debt. And so it gives investors the ability to have a leverage play, but a very safe leverage play, in that you're not, in a consumer, usually when you're going to get leverage on Bitcoin, it's usually some sort of leverage type play. And that's very, very risky if the price, because of the volatility in Bitcoin.
It's just different, right?
Yeah.
Explain, dig into that a little bit more. Why is it not necessarily as risky?
Yeah, I mean, often if a consumer's trying to do it, they're using margin based. And so if your Bitcoin was worth 100,000 and suddenly the Bitcoin price drops for a period of time, even just for a short window, then you could have a margin call. Unless you have the available cash, then that your Bitcoin that you've got on leverage could just be sold automatically. And so you never want to be doing anything that's margin based, particularly in Bitcoin, where it's still volatile today. In our world, we've got our balance sheet. We'll then be able to create some debt products, and we'll be able to allow investors to invest their money into a debt instrument, and they will pay a yield on that. And we'll be able to take that money and put it into Bitcoin. But that amount of debt that we'll be holding will only be a much smaller percentage of our overall balance sheet.
Right.
And so, we'll look to use our equity to be able to raise more capital. We'll do that through, direct placements with institutional type investors or even high net worths, as well as we'll have this ATM facility. So it's called At the Money. This isn't being commonly used in New Zealand, but we may be one of the first companies to use it. And so this allows the company to essentially be able to sell stock on market at a certain price. Now we use a third-party broker. And so what happens is we have a third party who's going to sell some of the company's stock on market. we will issue a notice to the broker to say, okay, today or this week, you can sell up to X number of shares at a minimum price of X, and then they can go on market and to be able to sell that. And that allows us to actually be able to raise capital.
These are new shares.
Correct.
That have been issued.
Correct.
And then at a minimum floor price.
Correct.
So you kind of regulate that a little bit.
That's right.
Got it. Okay.
And, you know, in a normal company, this type of capital raising is probably not that useful, because usually when you're raising capital as a company, you're raising it for the next 12 or 18 months and you just sit in your bank and you hold it there. In our instance, we won't need the capital to run our core business. Our core business is, you know, not quite profitable, but we're almost there, and we've got, you know, reasonable capital to do that. But in our instance, we're going to raise the money within that same week. We'll be deploying that money directly into Bitcoin. And so it's quite unique in that you're able to take that investment and instantly be able to deploy that into an asset that you believe is actually growing into the future,
which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to that. So going back to the debt products.
Yep.
What would that look like in a bit more detail? We're talking about convertible notes, about preference shares, or
yeah, it could be a range of those different things. New Zealand does have its own listed debt market.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we'll definitely be considering using that. We might do some convertible note type structures. We might do some convertible, like Bitcoin backed convertible bonds.
Right.
There's a range of things that we'll definitely look at.
Okay.
And yeah, this will allow, I guess, attracting those sort of probably non-Bitcoiners to invest in fixed income products where they're looking for a yield that's paying them an interest rate on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, and it can be backed by our Bitcoin holdings.
I think it's pretty much consensus view that regardless of whether it's good or bad, interest rates are probably going to be trending down.
Yep.
And there's a lot of cash on the sidelines looking for other opportunities.
Correct.
Traditionally in New Zealand, and this is probably true in Australia as well, when interest rates go down, it finds its way back into property.
Yes.
And that creates all sorts of problems in terms of inequality, and then government, and just things get messy. So if there is other things for people to invest in, and increasingly the whole digital asset ecosystem is kind of like a giant sponge,
Correct,
which could soak up that extra money creation, rather than have those spillover effects. So when you're thinking about what your requirements are as an investor, you want a safe, predictable return coming back. But with these types of products, you're also getting the ability to convert it into equity, I guess.
Exactly.
In the future.
Right? Yeah. So it may be that it is an instrument that we allow investors to convert into equity, or it may not be. And so I think we'll end up having multiple different ranges of products.
Similar to what strategy.
Exactly.
Done.
Exactly.
And how do you feel like the New Zealand market will respond to this? Because I'm aware that New Zealanders in general are fairly cautious in their approach to things that are new. They like to see it being adopted elsewhere first.
Yep.
And this is pretty new globally,
yes,
let alone in New Zealand. So how do you feel like the market's going to respond?
I think there's still a fair bit of education to take place in New Zealand, but it's probably a pretty good time now. I think I've had a number of meetings actually even this week and speaking to some institutional investors. And historically, if I'd gone to some of those meetings and mentioned Bitcoin, they'd be like, yeah, like we don't want to talk about it. Today, they're like, hang on, we need to actually learn more about this. And they're a lot more open and wanting to learn more. They may not necessarily understand what Bitcoin is, but they're definitely willing to listen.
Yeah.
And I think as they start to see what we're actually doing and start to see our playbook actually play out, then I think there'll be more interest in wanting to learn more about what's actually happening and why Bitcoin and why not, you know, another cryptocurrency. And there's a lot of learning to take place and education. And so, yeah, we'll be a voice to be able to provide that education too.
I've been doing a lot of that probably in the last 3 or 4 weeks as well. And it's been surprising in a couple of different ways. I'm surprised at the openness.
Yep.
Like people are genuinely interested in learning what is Bitcoin, why is it different to the other assets, and just how does it work, all that sort of stuff. But then I'm also surprised at how asleep people have been at the wheel over the past 5 years when it's gone from like 10,000
Yeah.
100,000. You haven't noticed yet?
Yeah.
But again, I think that's encouraging. You know, there's still time. Nothing stops this train, but occasionally it slows down. On, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So when you think about your strategy or your milestones or your KPIs, what are some of the goals that you're trying to achieve in the like short to medium term?
One, get listed. That's the thing we've been working on in the last few months, and there's a lot of work that's going into that process. And thankfully, we're almost there, and so we're almost at the finish line, which is really nice.
Yeah.
And then I think, you know, it's starting to buy Bitcoin. The market responded really well in Australia when we started to buy Bitcoin. And then the market responded, negatively when we stopped being able to buy Bitcoin because we got stopped. And so I think investors, were disappointed that we got stopped, and so they'll be really happy to see us being able to continue to start being able to buy Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Our shareholder base now is filled with lots of Bitcoiners from around the world, not just in Australia. There's lots of investors from overseas. And so I think we'll be able to do is actually bring lots of capital from outside of New Zealand into New Zealand by being able to attract those overseas investors looking to deploy capital, because in Bitcoin treasuries across the world, they're looking at getting access to that.
There's not like a lot of options yet. There's a growing number of options, but not in this part of the world.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And so do you feel like there's a point of difference? And I guess maybe another way for me to ask that is, why would a New Zealand-based investor choose to invest in locate versus, say, strategy?
And so I think you'll think about this in the future as like, okay, well, you have a number of banks in Australia, you have a number of banks in New Zealand, you have a number of banks in the US, and these treasury companies will end up being like banks. They'll have very large balance sheets across the world. And so you will wanting to be investing in your local bank. And we'll be like that. We'll be the New Zealand treasury company. And so for New Zealand people, it's much easier to invest in a local company. It's much easier to trade than necessarily trading on overseas stocks. And there's also probably some tax advantages in being able to invest in a local company versus something overseas. There's tax implications about investing in an overseas company if you go over that $50,000 limit.
Yeah.
And so I think those tax efficiencies are probably going to make sense for local residents to be able to buy, and also the accessibility on the New Zealand Stock Exchange.
And do you feel like these Bitcoin treasury companies, you're kind of alluding to this already, but in the future, are we going to see these companies morph into a new type of financial institution where it's not necessarily governed by the same set of rules, whether they create their own rules, too big to fail at that stage? I don't know. But do you kind of see it as like the replacement almost in a sense?
I think so. You look at like strategy now, and I think in terms of listed companies in the US, they're about the 5th or 6th largest company in terms of size of treasury. And so I don't think it will take long for them to be actually the number one in the US. And I think that's because they're holding this really large balance of Bitcoin. The Bitcoin price is only going to increase because the currencies around the world are getting devalued against Bitcoin.
And this is a way basically to extract the currency through these new financial products that get issued. And that's effectively transferring analog wealth, converting it into analog wrapped digital wealth initially.
Correct.
But then eventually, are we going to see situations in the future where we're trading in alternative forms of money that are effectively like bits of equity and companies like this? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, look, I don't know.
It's too far.
I think for us right now, it's like, we know that Bitcoin is the future, and so it's acquiring as much of that as we possibly can. Once you have that very large balance sheet, there's going to be all sorts of things that you're going to be able to do with that balance sheet, and different types of products that we're going to be able to innovate. And so I think, having people that are running these companies that are entrepreneurs who have got technology experience is going to be really important. I think a lot of the things that banks have sort of missed out on is the innovation that needed to have taken place. A lot of the banks are still running very, very legacy systems, and it's very, very difficult to then replace those systems. And you're seeing that even with, a lot of the exchanges around the world as well. And so having people at the top that are technology and understand the technology is going to be really important.
Right. And going back to the openness generally between two different countries, I know you would have had a lot of conversations with lawyers over here, the regulators, but then in Australia, when you first started doing this, you would have definitely faced a bit of backlash, I'm guessing, especially from some of your investors. But I think your share price jumped up 64% after you decided to do it. So what does that say about the actual market that you're trying to serve? Does it say that maybe traditional finance is still just out of touch with where the puck is going?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think there's a lot of people that own Bitcoin today. There's a lot of people that understand what Bitcoin is, and then they're wanting to be able to get that exposure in an equity as well. And so they look at a company like ourselves and see in the future, this will be a leverage play on Bitcoin. And so if you have a really strong belief that you think Bitcoin's going to go up, then owning a Bitcoin treasury business makes a lot of sense.
Now, can you break down just how the flywheel sort of concept works? You mentioned the at the money thing. You take that money, you directly buy Bitcoin, and that kind of creates this feedback loop. Can you just break down how you see that working specifically in your case?
Yeah. So the key is we'll be raising equity. So we'll be issuing more of our shares. And generally you're doing that at a higher price each time. And you're able to do that at a higher price each time because, let's say this week we raise $1 million. We take that $1 million, we deploy it directly into Bitcoin. And then so companies now got an extra $1 million worth of Bitcoin. What you'll see over time is likely the Bitcoin price will go up. And as that goes up, then the overall size of your balance sheet actually increases. And you're doing this on a consistent weekly basis where you're raising capital and pulling that capital and directly into your balance sheet. And so what almost happens is this flywheel starts to kick in to take place. And then alongside that, you're using the ATM facility to do that. You're getting more demand for people buying your stock. And then you're also then able to issue capital. It might be some sort of preference type shares, or it might be some direct placements to other sort of larger institutional investors.
And people pay a premium for that because they see the strategy that you're following.
Correct.
And then that just reinforces so you don't see that there's going to be a limitation there in the future when there's other companies that start adopting a similar strategy. It kind of feels like this isn't just, hey, you got to be first and it's only a season and then it'll fade away. It kind of feels like the runway is a bit longer. In my mind, but
I think that's right. I mean, in the future, everyone's going to hold Bitcoin. Every company's going to hold Bitcoin on their balance sheet. But then you will have companies like ourselves that really want to hold the most amount of Bitcoin. And so we will have a strategy to consistently be buying. Not every company is going to do that. And I think there's going to take some time for the market to get educated to do that. And so in our instance, you needed a founder and CEO to adopt it. Then they've got to convince the board, and then they've got to convince their investors. And that process takes a bit of time. And you got to have some real conviction in being able to do that today. That's going to be easier in the future because they're going to look at companies like ourselves and be able to then follow suit. And even in the ASX, we saw post us doing it, there was about 4 or 5 other companies in the ASX that then tried to attempt doing this as well. Not at the same scale, but as a smaller scale, but then they also got stopped.
For the same reason.
For the same reason.
Are they going to be coming over as well?
Who knows? We'll see. It's a difficult process. It's not a simple process in moving. It's quite complex, and there's a lot of legal work to be done. And so, you need to have the right people inside of your company to be able to do that, and the right funding to be able to do that as well.
And have you found your legal team especially? Have you found them pretty good?
No,
I know some of the people that you've been working with. And that makes a difference.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got a very good legal firm here in New Zealand, using Chapman Tripp. And then in Australia, we've got a very good firm as well. But importantly, I've got a very good board who's very experienced, who's done a lot of transactions before. And so that's been really useful, as well as having a very important, is a CFO. And a CFO who's done a lot of banking and IPOs previously, done a lot of M&A, and so understands how to run these types of deals. Because without that critical role as the CFO, this would have been very, very difficult, because I would have been completely consumed in doing all of that work. And I've got a very good CFO who's been able to manage the majority of this process.
That's cool. So in terms of the core business, what Locate actually do, do you feel like that is like the starter motor to justify the Bitcoin Treasury strategy? Is that something that you're going to return back to after this season of digital capitalization is complete? Or is that something that will just fade away when the real work begins of becoming a Bitcoin financial institution of some sort?
We still see there's a huge opportunity in what we're doing in the logistics software space. And we've been building, our Locate to You product for the last sort of 4 or 5 years. And we've built a really good product. It's used by some really big businesses. And we want to see that continue to keep on expanding. And so we're going to actively keep on promoting that product, keep on innovating on that product. And then we'll look and see, in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, what does the market then look like? We will have a much larger balance sheet than we have today. And can we use that balance sheet to then go and acquire our competitors in this space? It's definitely something we're going to consider and look at. And so, it's definitely not, we stop what we're doing in our software business. We actively keep doing that. We'll keep hiring inside of that business and keep growing that business, and ultimately be able to take the profits of that business and then build that into buying more Bitcoin.
So a lot of people would be concerned about Bitcoin generally because it's volatile, right? And volatility is often confused with risk.
The
chance of permanent loss of capital. It's not. It just goes up and down in value, especially when you're trading fiat currency for another form of money, i.e. digital gold, which is mathematically scarce.
Yes.
Cannot fiddle with it.
Correct.
probably risk.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you're thinking in dollar terms, it is going to be volatile. And
Yep.
when it comes to a public company wrapping itself around as the custodian of Bitcoin,
Yeah.
understandably, there would be some concerns around that. So how would you frame it for those types of investors that would look at Locate on the NZX and go, "Ooh, I've heard they're doing some sort of risky Bitcoin."
Yeah, sure.
What would you say to that?
The first thing I always go back to is, what is money? And I always go back to that framework as what is money, and then you start to understand actually, well, the money today used to be backed by gold, it's not backed by gold today, and the governments have the ability to keep on printing. And so you've got that fundamental belief. Okay, well, the money is not scarce that we have today. We just believe it used to be, and we believe it's valuable because we've been taught it's valuable. The money we hold today wasn't what was used 200 years ago. It was something else. They were trading in other ways by using lots of different things and shells or all sorts of different ways of being able to trade. And so we're in this revolution now where there's a digital world, there's a new type of money that's been created, and it's got a bunch of properties around how that's been designed to be a really effective way of transferring means between people. And so there's this transition that's occurring. And so that's the first thing I always go back to is really deeply understanding that. And there's a number of good books to read on that. And then I think about, okay, well, if you're buying Bitcoin or buying a stock that has Bitcoin exposure, is think about it today. You buy it and you're going to look at it in 4 years, or you look at it in 5 years' time. And is that stock going to be higher than where it is today? So very likely it will be. But if you're looking at it on a daily basis, you're going to have a really difficult time because you're going to see lots of volatility inside of that stock. And so if you can just buy it, close the door on it, and don't think about it for the next 4 or 5 years, that's going to be the best way of being able to manage that investment. Yeah. And along the way, maybe if you are looking at it, then maybe there's opportunities to be able to buy more at different times where it does actually dip. Yes. But it's having that conviction at the beginning and understanding why. And if you don't understand the why, then it becomes a really stressful ride. Yeah. And so I think it's that part is really critical. And then when you see a downturn, you're like, okay, well, this is Bitcoin's on sale. There's a cheaper way of being able to buy that. But I also think as the market matures, and now you've got well over 150 companies that are buying Bitcoin on their balance sheet, that's going to turn into thousands of companies across the world. And you've now got all these companies now wanting to buy Bitcoin on their balance sheet. So the volatility is going to start to be removed as the Bitcoin starts to become more mainstream and used by lots of companies across the world. And even
a lot more institutions buying the dip effectively, right?
Yeah, correct. Definitely. And even you've seen recently where there's been sort of really large amounts where people have bought Bitcoin in the very early days. They didn't know what they had, but they might have had thousands of Bitcoin. They've liquidated like billion-dollar positions. The market might have dropped a small amount, but it's recovered quite quickly. And each time that actually happens, that's very good for the Bitcoin network because those 1,000 Bitcoins are being distributed across now thousands of people. And that's really good for the network because there's a lot more people that are there joining the network. And you look at, some of the graphs of showing the adoption of the internet and what that looked like, and then what the adoption of Bitcoin is and where we're actually in that cycle. Like it looks like we're in sort of the late 90s to early 2000s in sort of that cycle. So we're still very early. And so just because you didn't buy Bitcoin when it was $1,000 doesn't mean you've missed out. It's still, I think, very, very early because, it's highly likely it's going to go into the millions.
Recently, like at the time of recording, at least, and this might be different when this episode is released, but price of gold over $4,000 an ounce.
Yep.
Price of silver over $50 per ounce. It's pretty amazing to see that. But when I think of the holy trinity of scarcity, gold, silver, Bitcoin,
yep,
and I see what's happening with the price, it's really easy just to think a couple of things, right? Like I think, well, maybe fiat is at late stage death and decay, right?
Correct.
Maybe this is the next innings. We've just entered a new phase. The next thought I think is maybe more people are starting to cotton on to this whole money isn't really what we thought it was type thing.
Definitely.
Do you think that there is like a bit of an awakening with more normies in terms of just the fragility of the fiat financial system?
Yeah, I think it's now affecting people. Like you go to the supermarket and what you could buy previously and you walk out with, $100 was a whole heap more than what you can walk out with today. Yeah. And so I think there's more people starting to wake up and see what's actually happening. I guess you've seen the Bitcoin price and what it's been able to be done over this, the last few years and how much it's actually increased. And it's increased because the fiat currency has been devalued. And so I think there's definitely more awareness of what's happening. But also you look at now there's the ETFs, and you've got companies like BlackRock now having the ETFs. And you look at the graph of when the adoption of the Bitcoin ETF versus when the gold ETF actually started, and the graphs, it's crazy for what the adoption of Bitcoin. And you look at the amount of Bitcoin that's been acquired through the ETF on a daily basis versus what's happening with gold. And then you think about the supply cap on Bitcoin. There's going to be a supply shock at some point in time when, there's just not going to be enough of Bitcoin around. Every millionaire across the world wants to own one Bitcoin. There's not enough Bitcoin.
It's nuts because now we're talking about these companies with much larger balance sheets than the everyday person.
Correct.
And they're all out there hoovering it up, right? Effectively competing to be the first one to be the biggest. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't know where it goes, but it's probably not going to be insignificant.
Correct.
To what happens from here, right? And when I think about gold and silver, yeah, you can kind of have a bit of a leverage play by buying the mining companies themselves who extract it out of the earth. And yeah, you can get some outperformance based on the underlying commodity that they're pulling out of the ground.
Yes.
And with Bitcoin, you can actually do the same thing.
Yes.
And I think you can buy mining companies.
That's right.
Yeah. With this, though, it's kind of like another picks and shovels approach, right? Where you're buying a company that doesn't necessarily produce more Bitcoin, but it has a strategy to just accumulate.
Yes.
And I find that fascinating. And I wonder if that multi-dimensional aspect and how you can get exposure to Bitcoin, I wonder where that goes next. Like, what would you speculate on? How would we see Bitcoin? Like, what is the next Bitcoin investment if it's not just holding it?
Yeah, I was speaking to someone yesterday and they were talking about a Bitcoin insurance, and life insurance. So I think there's going to be a whole range of different things that's going to start looking at traditional finance and how Bitcoin sits inside of that. So I think there's going to be a lot of innovation that's going to occur there.
It's going to be fascinating, I think. Now, the big question that we've saved to last here is when is the big day? So in New Zealand, if you were to list on the NZX, there's obviously so much work that you have to get done. And tell me a little bit about where you're at right now and when you expect to go live.
Yeah. So the good news is we've gone through a lot of the painful legal process. We have to produce a PDS. We've completed that. That's going through the final stages of approval right now. We have to complete a shareholder vote in the Australian market, which we're expecting to sort of complete by the end of November. And so there's a few regulatory things that we have to go through and court approval processes we have to go through. But by the end of November, that we think that should be completed, which means early December, we should be in a position where we'll be listing on the NZX. And so, it'll be really exciting to be here in Auckland for the listing day and see the company, a new beginning, being backed by Bitcoin.
That's cool. Okay, now if people want to learn more or to get up to speed in terms of any latest announcements as to when you're listing, where's the best place they can go just to get updates on?
Yeah, so right now, locate.tech, TECH, that's our website. All of our announcements that we do to the ASX are all available there. All the company history from when we listed in 2021 is all available there. And a lot of our videos of investor updates will be posted there. We update the market every quarter. So end of October, we'll have a quarterly update to the market to talk about what we're doing, and we'll talk in more detail around the transaction. And then, once we're listed in New Zealand, we'll be available. The ticker code will be LOC. So LOC is on the ASX right now, and then it'll be LOC on the NZX.
That's awesome.
Cool.
Oh, well done. And thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me today.
No, thanks, Darcy. It's great to talk about Bitcoin as always.
Cool. Cheers.
Thank you.